What I'm about to tell you is something that you wouldn't even believe could happen in real life. It's the kind of thing that sounds too bizarre, almost surreal. But I lived through it, and I can tell you firsthand that reality can be stranger than any story you've heard. I was never the type to dwell on the unexpected. I liked things straightforward, practical. I ran my household with a strict sense of order, and I expected the same from my wife. We had our roles clearly defined, and I saw no reason for unnecessary complications. Life was simple, or so I thought. My wife, on the other hand, was different. She was always searching for something new, something to fill her time or bring excitement. She wasn't content with the routine and needed to feel like she was part of something bigger. At first, I thought it was just her nature. She had a restless energy, a need for change that I didn't quite understand but tolerated. She liked to involve herself in various social circles, constantly trying to fit in or find a place where she felt comfortable. She was pleasant enough, polite, and eager to make friends. I thought it was harmless, just part of her personality. As long as she handled her responsibilities at home, I had no complaints. But looking back, I realize now that there was something else, a kind of emptiness she was trying to fill. She wanted to feel interesting, to have something to talk about, something that made her stand out. I didn't pay much attention to it then, thinking it was just another one of her passing whims. The reality of what would come later was something beyond my comprehension at the time. I had my own interests, and I was content with them. I didn't think much about how different we were in that regard. But I would soon learn that this difference between us was much more significant than I had ever imagined. One evening, my wife came home from work looking a bit down. It wasn't her usual self, and I could tell something was bothering her. Naturally, I asked what the problem was. She sighed, dropping her bag on the kitchen counter, and started talking about her colleagues. She said they all had these fascinating hobbies. Some played tennis, others were into golf, and a few even did pottery. They always had something to share, stories about their weekends or the new skills they were learning. She explained that she felt out of place because she didn't have anything like that to offer. I listen to them and get interested, sure, she said, and I feel comfortable in the group, but I want to be more than just the listener. I want to be the one with something interesting to say for once. She went on, saying that she wanted a hobby of her own, something unique that would make her feel alive, something different from what her colleagues were doing. I listened to her with a sense of indifference at first. In my experience, all trouble started the same way, a woman sitting around with too much time on her hands. I figured this was another case of that. Still, I didn't dismiss her outright. She seemed genuinely bothered, so I nodded and told her we'd figure something out. It wouldn't hurt to look into a few options if it would get her out of this slump. In the back of my mind, I already knew that finding this special hobby wouldn't be an easy task. I'd seen her lose interest in things before, quickly moving from one activity to the next. But this time she seemed determined, like she really needed something to latch onto. So, I decided to humor her. Maybe it would be good for her to have something to focus on. I told her I'd ask around, see if any of my colleagues or acquaintances had ideas, and we could also look online. She seemed relieved that I was willing to help. I guess she thought it meant I understood what she was going through. But honestly, I just wanted her to find something so she wouldn't complain about it anymore. It was easier to keep the peace that way. As I watched her that evening, I wondered if this was just another phase or if she genuinely felt lost. Either way, I figured it was worth finding her something to do. After all, if she was busy with her own interests, she'd be less likely to get restless and start bringing that energy into our home. I took it upon myself to help her find this hobby she was so keen on. At work, during breaks, I started asking my colleagues if they or their wives had any interesting pastimes. I wasn't exactly used to these kinds of conversations, but I figured it was worth the effort if it meant getting my wife off my back. Some of the guys mentioned fishing, painting, or even learning a musical instrument. I made a mental note of all the suggestions and thought I'd run them by her later. In the evenings, I sat down with her and we went through some of the options. We even looked online for classes and activities in our area. It felt odd for me, sitting there browsing through pottery workshops, yoga sessions, and cooking classes. It wasn't my kind of thing and frankly, I didn't care for any of it. But she seemed hopeful and I was determined to find something that would keep her engaged. At the end of the day, a busy wife is a happy wife, or so I believed. We signed her up for a couple of these classes. One was a pottery workshop that a few of my colleagues' wives recommended. She seemed excited about it at first. She went to the classes, came home talking about how relaxing it was to work with clay, and even brought back a few pieces she made. I thought, well, maybe this will do the trick for a few weeks. Things were fine. She seemed content, and I figured we had finally found something that stuck. But, as I had half expected, she soon started to lose interest. One evening, she came home and sighed, saying that the pottery wasn't quite what she was looking for. She admitted that it felt like she was just following the crowd again, doing something anyone could do. She wanted something more unique, something that would stand out. I knew then that we were back at square one. All that effort, and we still hadn't found what she wanted. Not one to give up easily, I tried suggesting a few more options of painting class this time, then some outdoor hiking clubs. She tried those too. The first few times, she'd come back with stories telling me how great it was. But eventually, the excitement faded, and she'd say the same thing, "It's just not it." I was starting to get frustrated. It seemed like nothing would satisfy her, no matter what we tried. Still, I pressed on, determined to find something that would keep her engaged. In my mind, it was only a matter of time before she either found what she was looking for, or realized that this quest for uniqueness was pointless. Either way, I was committed to seeing this through, if only to put an end to her complaints once and for all. I've never been one to get caught up in hobbies like my wife. I had my own way of relaxing, playing computer games with my friends, grabbing a drink at the bar every now and then, and maybe watching a match or two on TV. It was simple, and it worked for me. I didn't need to impress anyone or find some activity to stand out. I was content with what I had, and I never felt the urge to be more interesting or unique. That kind of thinking just wasn't in my nature. One night, I was scrolling through TikTok, something I did occasionally when I had nothing else going on. I wasn't really looking for anything in particular, just passing the time. As I flipped through the videos, one clip caught my attention, a woman riding a horse to the tune of "Be My Lover." It was flashy, with her moving gracefully in sync with the music. I paused for a moment, watching as she rode confidently, the horse responding to her every move. It looked exhilarating, and I thought to myself, now, that's different. An idea started to form in my head. I knew my wife had been desperate to find something exciting and unique, and this seemed like the kind of thing that might do the trick. Horseback riding wasn't something you saw every day, and it certainly wasn't like tennis or pottery. It had a thrill to it, something that might give her that sense of excitement she was after. I figured it was worth a shot. When I mentioned it to her, she lit up instantly. Her eyes widened, and she leaned in, asking me more about what I'd seen. I told her about the video, how the woman looked so alive, riding with confidence and style. My wife was sold on the idea right away. "That's exactly what I've been looking for," she said, her excitement clear. She didn't hesitate and immediately began searching for horseback riding lessons nearby. For the first time in a while, it felt like we might have found something that would actually work. Within days, she had found a place that offered lessons, and she signed up. She was eager to start, more enthusiastic than I'd seen her in a long time. She kept talking about how different it was from anything she had tried before, and how she couldn't wait to tell her colleagues about it. I thought, well, maybe this time we've hit the mark. It felt good to see her so energized, even if I didn't fully understand the appeal myself. I still wasn't sure if it would last, but I was hopeful. At the very least, it seemed like horseback riding had the excitement and uniqueness she was searching for. I figured it was better than her moping around, and if it kept her engaged, then it was worth the effort. So I watched her head off to her first lesson, thinking that maybe this would be the thing to finally settle her restless spirit. After her first lesson, my wife came home with a level of enthusiasm I hadn't seen in a long time. She was absolutely beaming, practically glowing with excitement. The moment she walked through the door, she couldn't stop talking. She went on and on about how amazing it felt to ride the horse, how powerful and free she felt being up there. She described the way the horse moved beneath her, the thrill of the wind against her face, and how it felt like a completely new experience, exactly what she had been craving. She told me that her colleagues were all supportive and impressed when she mentioned that she was taking up horseback riding. They'd reacted positively, telling her how adventurous and bold it was, unlike the usual hobbies people took up. She seemed genuinely happy that she had found something that set her apart from the rest. It was clear that she felt like she had finally found her place, something that made her stand out in her circle. She said it felt good to be the one with the interesting story for a change. For the next few weeks, it was all she could talk about. Every time she came back from a lesson, she was eager to share every detail: how she was learning to control the horse, the new techniques the instructor showed her, and even how she had started to bond with the animal. She was practically bursting with excitement. It was a constant stream of stories, and while I wasn't particularly interested, I nodded along. As long as she was happy and engaged, that was enough for me. A month passed, and her enthusiasm didn't wane. She stuck with it, unlike the other hobbies she had tried before. She seemed genuinely invested this time, always counting down the days until her next lesson. It was almost like she had become obsessed with it, and her whole schedule started revolving around these lessons. I thought maybe we'd finally found something that would last. She even started picking up new gear: riding boots, a helmet, and other things she said were necessary. I didn't mind. If it kept her motivated and excited, it was worth it. Besides, she seemed more confident, more alive. For a moment, I thought maybe this was what she had been missing all along. Maybe this was what she needed to feel complete. I was just glad to see her in high spirits again. It was a relief to have some peace in the house without her complaining about feeling bored or left out. I didn't understand the thrill of riding, but as long as it kept her occupied and happy, I was willing to support it. It seemed, at least for now, that horseback riding was exactly what she had been searching for. One evening, my wife went out to meet a friend of hers. They often got together to chat, catch up, and gossip about the usual things women talk about. I didn't pay much attention to these meetups. They were a regular part of her routine. But during this particular evening, she sent me out of the blue. She wrote, "I have something to tell you later. You won't believe it. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured it was just some silly story she picked up from her friend." When she got home, she was practically bursting with excitement, like she was holding onto the punchline of a joke she couldn't wait to tell. She kicked off her shoes and went straight into it, barely taking a breath. She told me that her friend had recently bought a dildo, but not just any kind, one that was shaped like a horse's genitals. She emphasized how massive it was, gesturing with her hands to show the size, and laughed about how absurd it all seemed. She said her friend showed it to her as a joke, and they both laughed about it, wondering who would even buy something like that. "It's crazy, right?" she said, still giggling. "How do people even use these things?" She seemed amused by the whole situation, treating it as nothing more than a bit of shocking humor between friends. I couldn't help but chuckle myself, but it was more out of awkwardness than anything else. It was a strange topic, even for her. I made a quick joke to lighten the mood, something along the lines of, "Well, that's wild. Some people really are into the weirdest things." I didn't think much of it beyond that. In my mind, it was just another one of those odd things people do that didn't concern us. We laughed it off, and I moved on, not giving it a second thought. After all, what did it have to do with us? It was just another one of her friend's strange stories. She kept talking about it for a few more minutes, still laughing, but I could see she was almost fascinated by the absurdity of it all. She asked me if I could ever imagine someone actually using something like that. I shrugged and told her it was beyond me. "People are strange," I said, keeping my tone casual. As far as I was concerned, it was nothing more than a weird conversation topic that would be forgotten by the next day. Once the laughter died down, we moved on to other things, and I didn't think much about the story afterward. It seemed like just another harmless joke between friends, nothing worth overthinking. In my eyes, it was just another sign that people were willing to try anything for a thrill these days. Little did I know, this seemingly innocent conversation would take on a whole new meaning later on, but at that moment, I had no reason to suspect anything unusual. Not long after that conversation, I noticed a change in my wife's behavior. She began spending more time at the stables, staying later than she used to. At first, I didn't think much of it. She was passionate about her new hobby, and I figured it was only natural for her to want to immerse herself in it, but after a while, the frequency and length of her visits started to stand out. She'd tell me she was staying behind to help out or practice a bit more, but something about the way she said it didn't sit right with me. I tried asking her about the lessons like I used to, but her answers became shorter, less detailed. Before, she couldn't stop talking about her time at the stables, sharing every little detail about her progress or the horses she worked with. Now, she'd just shrug and say it was fine or the usual. It was as if she didn't want to discuss it anymore. I couldn't help but feel like she was hiding something, and that feeling started to gnaw at me. I considered the possibility that she might have met someone there, another rider, or maybe one of the instructors. I'd seen it happen before with other people. They get caught up in a new hobby, meet someone who shares their passion, and things escalate. It was the only explanation that made sense at the time. If she was acting secretive, it had to mean she was trying to hide something from me. I wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but the signs were there, and I couldn't ignore them. I kept these thoughts to myself, but I started paying closer attention to her behavior. She was always on her phone when she got back, and she seemed distant, like her mind was elsewhere. It felt like she was slipping away, and I didn't like the feeling of being left in the dark. I was suspicious, but I wanted to be sure before confronting her. If there was something going on, I needed proof, not just a gut feeling. So, I made a plan. One evening, when she told me she'd be staying late again, I decided to drive to the stables myself. I didn't tell her, of course. I wanted to see for myself what was really happening. If she was hiding something or someone I was going to find out, I figured I'd park a bit farther away and walk over quietly. It was the only way to confirm my suspicions. The idea of having to do this felt ridiculous. I never thought I'd be the type to check up on my own wife, but her behavior left me no choice. I needed to know if my gut instinct was right. If she was being unfaithful, at least I'd have the truth, and I could decide what to do next. So, with my mindset, I headed out that evening, determined to finally get to the bottom of what was really going on at the stables. I arrived at the stables, parking the car a bit away from the entrance so I wouldn't be noticed. I stepped out and made my way quietly, staying in the shadows as much as possible. The place was dimly lit, with only a few lights on, and it was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of hay or a horse shifting in its stall. My heart was pounding, and my mind raced with possibilities. I was prepared to see her with someone else, bracing myself for the worst, but nothing could have prepared me for what I actually saw. As I crept closer, I heard faint noises coming from one of the stalls. I walked slowly, staying silent, until I had a clear view, and that's when I saw her. She was completely naked, standing next to the horse. I froze, unable to process what I was witnessing. She was touching the animal in ways I could barely comprehend, her hands moving with a familiarity that made my skin crawl. She rubbed herself against the horse, and I felt my stomach turn. It was a grotesque, surreal sight, something beyond anything I could have imagined. My eyes went wide and I stood there for a moment, unable to react. All I could think was, better it had been a lover, that would have been understandable, something I could have dealt with rationally. But this was beyond reason. I felt an anger boiling inside me, mixed with a wave of disgust. I couldn't hold back any longer. I stepped forward and shouted her name, my voice echoing through the quiet of the stable. She jumped, startled, and immediately tried to cover herself, scrambling to grab her clothes. "This isn't what it looks like," she yelled, her voice shaking. She had fear in her eyes, like she knew she had been caught in something unspeakable. But I couldn't listen to her excuses. There was no explanation for this. No words could justify what I had just seen. I didn't say anything else. I just turned on my heel and walked back towards the car, my footsteps heavy with anger and disgust. Her voice followed me, pleading, trying to explain. But it was too late. I didn't want to hear it. Whatever she was going to say, I knew it wouldn't change anything. The image was burned into my mind, and I knew there was no going back from this. By the time I reached the car, my hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I could still hear her shouting behind me, but I didn't turn back. I got into the car, slammed the door shut, and drove off. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to get away, to put as much distance between myself and that horrific scene as possible. There was no coming back from this. When I got home, I was seething. I couldn't even think straight. The only thing I knew was that I needed to get her out of the house. I went straight to our bedroom and started throwing her things into bags, clothes, shoes, anything that belonged to her. I didn't care about making a mess. I just wanted everything of hers gone. The rage that had built up in me on the drive home wasn't subsiding, and seeing her things around the room only fueled it further. Not long after, I heard her car pull up outside. I knew she had followed me back, but I didn't stop what I was doing. She rushed through the door, her face still pale and panicked. "What are you doing?" she shouted, but I didn't bother answering her. I kept throwing her stuff out, bag by bag, my mind focused on one thing: getting her out of my sight. The scene from the stables was still fresh in my head, and I felt sick just looking at her. She tried to explain herself, reaching out to grab my arm. "Wait, listen, it's not what you think," she said, her voice desperate. "It's a procedure for the horse they needed for breeding." I stopped for a second, staring at her, and then laughed a bitter, disbelieving laugh. "And you had to be naked to do that?" I asked, my voice cold. Her explanation made no sense, and the fact that she was even trying to justify it made me even angrier. She looked down, her eyes darting as she struggled to find the words. "I thought it would be easier that way," she said, almost whispering, as if she knew how absurd it sounded. "It's supposed to help calm the horse." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was like she was trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to convince me. I shook my head, feeling my hands clench into fists. "You expect me to believe that? You think I'm stupid?" I pushed past her, throwing another bag of her things onto the floor. "I don't know what's worse," I said, my voice raised. "The fact that you did that, or that you're lying to my face right now." She started crying, but I wasn't moved. Her tears meant nothing to me at that moment. All I could think about was how twisted the whole situation was and how she'd managed to drag me into it. She kept pleading, saying she didn't know what else to do, that she'd panicked when I walked in. "I didn't want you to see me like that," she said, as if that made any difference. It was too late. I had already seen everything, and there was no erasing it. I felt like I was in a nightmare, one I couldn't wake up from. The more she tried to explain, the angrier I got. Her words were nothing but excuses, and none of them made what she did any less disgusting. I continued packing her things, ignoring her sobs and her attempts to grab my arm. At that point, I was done listening. I didn't care what she had to say anymore. All I knew was that she had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. She betrayed me in a way I never thought possible. As far as I was concerned, whatever we had was over. I stood there, staring at her, feeling nothing but rage and disgust. The words came out before I could even think them through. "How could you betray me like that?" With a horse, of all things, I shouted, my voice echoing through the room. I could barely believe I was saying it, but the reality was even harder to comprehend. "You chose a horse over your own husband. Do you even realize how insane that sounds?" She flinched at my words, but I didn't care. There was no way to make sense of what she had done. She tried to step closer, reaching out as if to touch my arm, but I stepped back, refusing to let her near me. "Don't even try," I snapped, my eyes fixed on hers. "You think you can explain this away? There's nothing you can say that'll make this okay." Her tears continued to flow, and she kept shaking her head, repeating how it wasn't what it looked like. But it was too late for excuses. I had seen it with my own eyes, and no amount of talking was going to change what happened. "How could you choose something like that over me?" I continued, my voice growing louder. "I've heard of infidelity, but this is beyond anything I could have imagined." I felt my hands shaking with anger, my fists clenching as I struggled to keep my composure. "You humiliated me in a way I can't even describe. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I saw the guilt and fear in her eyes, but it didn't matter anymore. There was no coming back from this. She kept insisting it was just a procedure, that it was for the horse's sake and nothing more. But her words felt empty, like she was grasping at straws. "That's your excuse," I shot back, "that you had to do this for the horse, and you thought being naked was necessary? Do you even hear yourself?" I could see she was desperate, but every word she spoke only made me angrier. It was insulting, the way she tried to make it sound so innocent when it was anything but. At that moment, all I felt was a need to get her out of my sight. "I don't want to hear any more lies," I said, my voice cold and final. "Pack your things and leave." Now she started to plead, saying she could explain everything, but I was done. I wasn't going to stand there and listen to any more of her nonsense. The betrayal was too deep, too raw. It didn't matter what she said, there was no fixing this. I grabbed her bags, shoving them into her hands as she cried, still trying to make me listen. "You traded me for a horse," I said, shaking my head. "Just think about that. You gave up your marriage for something that doesn't even make sense." The words felt bitter in my mouth, and I could hardly believe I had to say them. But they were true, and there was no escaping that. As I pushed her out the door, she looked back, still crying, still trying to reach me. "Please, let me explain," she begged, but I didn't give her a chance. "It's over," I said, shutting the door behind her. "You made your choice." The house felt empty and cold as I stood there, listening to her footsteps fade away. The reality of it all was still sinking in, and as much as I tried to make sense of it, there was no logic to be found. What she had done was beyond comprehension, and I knew that nothing she said could ever change that. The divorce process was as cold and clinical as I expected. Once I had thrown her out and made it clear that there was no way back, we began the formalities. I contacted a lawyer the next day, determined to get everything done quickly. There was no sense in dragging things out. I knew what I had seen, and there was no reason to pretend that reconciliation was even an option. It felt like we were strangers, two people with no connection left between us. She tried to reach out a few times, sending messages and asking if we could talk, but I ignored her. I had nothing left to say. The betrayal was too deep, and I had no interest in hearing more excuses. My lawyer made it clear that it was best to keep everything simple. There was no need to make a scene or complicate the process, and I agreed. The faster we could end things, the better it would be for both of us. We filed for a no-fault divorce, and the paperwork went through quickly. We didn't have any children, so there were no custody battles or anything like that to worry about. The only things we needed to divide were our assets, which wasn't difficult. She had already moved out, and most of her belongings were gone. We agreed on the distribution of our savings and the house without much dispute. She seemed to want to end things quietly too, and for that, I was thankful. The whole situation was humiliating enough. The last thing I wanted was to drag it out in public. Throughout the entire process, I didn't tell any of my friends or colleagues the real reason for our divorce. I kept the details to myself, simply saying we had grown apart. It was easier that way. I didn't need their pity or their judgment. More importantly, I didn't want to ruin her reputation. Despite everything she had done, I figured there was no point in destroying her life further. Maybe, one day, she'd think about her actions and realize the consequences of her choice.